Ian. Ian is the long-standing member of the Natural History Society. Was a research entomologist, formerly head of ecology at Rothampton Research in Hertfordshire, and currently a visiting professor in biological science at the University of Hertfordshire. He is also an enthusiastic amateur botanist who has served as president and chair of the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, and is joint recorder for the vascular plants in Hertfordshire. Richard Bateman, standing in the corner over there, Richard. Professor Richard Bateman, welcome, thank you, is a plant systematist whose former roles include Head of Science at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, and Keeper of Botany at the Natural History Museum, London. He's currently an Honorary Research Fellow at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and Visiting Professor at the University of Reading. His first ever research paper, I believe, was appropriately published in the Transactions of the Natural History Society on Hertfordshire orchids back in 1981, so some time ago. Both of them, both Ian and Richard, have jointly shared a passion for wild orchids and have collaborated for 45 years or more to investigate the systematics of some critical orchid groups. Over this period, they have also served as joint taxonomic referees for the native orchids of Britain and Ireland. So it's really good to have the two of them here. And for those of you who don't know, it's worth just mentioning this lecture has been run for, must be getting on for 10 years now, in memory of Gerald Salisbury, who was himself a great naturalist, but also a really keen botanist, and who actually learnt his craft in a way, was mentored by his uncle, who was Sir Edward Salisbury, who was a former director of the Botanic Gardens at Kew, and indeed a former county recorder. So it's really topical and appropriate to be having a talk on orchids this evening. And I can think of no better qualified people to speak on the subject. I'm delighted to welcome Ian, with input no doubt from Richard, on tonight to present on this year's Gerald Salisbury lecture. Ian.
Thank you, Peter. I've been told I have to speak up, but again, I hope William is reasonably audible at the back there. So yeah, I'm very humbled. So many people have braved the elements tonight to come and attend, and so many friends in the audience, and I'm obviously very honoured to be giving this privileged lecture. This is the title slide, but in fact, I've got one of this is a species called common spotted orchid, which you're probably mostly familiar with, and the site is Roughdown Common, so to the right here would be the A41 embankment. On this calcareous turf there's a colony of common spotted orchids, and in June 2008 a local naturalist found these rather unusual plants where the flowers haven't fully opened, and the technical term you can use in that case is chrysostogamous. He contacted me and took me, and we went together to investigate it further. And the reason this is relevant to tonight is that the person who found it was Gerald Salisbury. Gerald was a great friend, he was a great botanist, and he's fully deserving of the accolade of having this lecture series named after him. And then we come to the title slide, and as Peter's already said, Richard and I have been partners in crime for longer really than we care to remember in terms of researching on orchids. But I spent a lot of my career at Rothamsted, and I started in January 1980. And on my first day, I think it was coffee time in the department, and I was meeting some future colleagues, and I mentioned that I was interested in orchids, and they said, well, you need to go down the corridor because there's a guy working down there who's also very keen on orchids. So I did, and that was Richard. We introduced ourselves. That was really the start of a very enduring friendship and a very productive collaboration. I'm not going to go into the scientific aspects of what we did together tonight, but very pertinent to tonight's talk is the fact, as we've already heard, that Richard published a paper in 1981. It was a consequence of about 3 or 4 years detailed surveying of the orchids of Hertfordshire. And this really helps to lay the foundation of the orchid account that went into Trevor's Flora of Hertfordshire. A lot of new sites discovered for a number of species. And so that was published in 1981. 2026, this is a sort of 45-year update. And this is the most embarrassing slide of the evening. On the left, I obviously took that because we haven't a clue where and when it was or what Richard was intending to do with the bucket. On the right here, the other non-bovine presence is John Doney. And I'm somewhat embarrassed that I'm giving much more attention to the cow than to one of the most distinguished botanists in the country. Anyway, tonight we're talking about orchids. They form a single, very cohesive family, and you think of them as very specialised. I have to stop sliding across the... There we go. They are, in fact, one of the two most diverse plant families in the world in terms of numbers of species. And I don't know if anyone would venture a guess as to what the other one is. So it's not grasses. It's the Asteraceae, the daisy family. So there are about 28,000 described species of orchids, mostly in the tropics, and they're mostly epiphytic. And there's countless hybrids and cultivars, tens of thousands of those. I don't know if anyone is actually keeping tabs on them. In Britain and Ireland, 51 species may increase. That's not because it's taxonomically volatile, but there are, as I'll say at the end, a few species occurring sporadically in the country. And we don't, as yet, know whether they should be added to that list. But in Hertfordshire, it's fairly certain that there are 22 extant species as of 2025. And 7 recent losses, and by recent I mean probably the last 50 to 60 years. So the challenge tonight is to give you an introduction to those 22. I'm going to have to be brief, and also make a mention of the 7 losses. I could go through in systematic order with descriptions and distribution maps, but that would be very boring for you and it would be very boring for me. So we need more of a thematic approach, and what I've decided is a very brief introduction, what's doing okay, so then you need what's not doing okay, unfortunately, what's been lost, and what might we gain. And so that's essentially the structure, going from optimism through pessimism and gloom back to optimism, I hope. So what is an orchid? This is the only introduction slide. It's early purple orchid, which I'll come back to again, but it gives you some idea of the basic structure of an orchid plant, a terrestrial one. So if you look at the left, underground there'll be a tuber, or a mass of tuberous roots. Above ground there's usually a rosette of leaves, and they may be broad, narrow, marked, unmarked, and then a stem leading up to the flower spike. And let me use this. The flowers usually have some sort of spur leading back from the centre of the flower, which contains or doesn't contain nectar. The flower itself in orchids, everything comes in threes. So 3 sepals and 3 petals, although that terminology isn't too often used. I mean, but Richard and I in our writings usually use the term inner and outer and inner perianth segments. Gets more and more confused with when people like Clive Stace call them inner and outer tepals, but it doesn't really matter so much. This is a flower of an early purple orchid. The two of the outer perianth segments, or the sepals, are held aloft. The other one and 2 of the inner petals, or inner perianth segments, are held in a hood protecting the reproductive organs. And the most notable feature is that the other petal is differentiated into what I will probably use the term interchangeably, a lip or a labellum. And this can be various shapes and sizes, it can be marked in various colours. It essentially serves to attract pollinators and act as a landing stage. Because I think everyone's aware that orchids go in for all sorts of intricate ways of attracting plants and reproductive strategies. We were introduced to those in a book well, first introduced in a book that was published in 1877 called The Various Contrivances by Which Orchids Are Pollinated by Insects. And that was put on by an author whose name has actually endured to the present day, which is Charles Darwin. And that really was a very early account of a bizarre range of devices that orchids use to ensure outcrossing, or in some cases to avoid it. So, what's doing okay? Now I'm going to take us on a orchidological journey around Hertfordshire. And we'll start in a trust reserve called Fox Covert. You probably know it. If you've been, I'm sure everyone's been to see the past flower colony on Church Hill and Thurfield Heath. If you go there, you'll normally end up walking down through Fox Covert to the gates that leads to Church Hill itself. And that would normally be probably mid-April, but if you go in mid-May, this is an incredible site for an orchid called white helleborine, which you might be able to see just there. It's not a terribly well differentiated orchid. There's no really clearly differentiated lip on this species. Flowers up the stem, white flowers. The largest colonies in the county are in Fox Covert, which is several hundred plants, and in Who Bit, which is near Telegraph Hill and abuts the Bedfordshire border. Again, several hundred plants. There's probably about 20 other colonies with lower numbers of plants in, scattered through the county. And I've just put this in for quick reference. This is a very closely related species called the narrow-leaved helleborine, and it differs primarily in the fact that the leaves are very narrow, strap-shaped and tapered. And this is a plant that has been confused in the past with white helleborine, and there have been some reports of it for Hertfordshire, but I mean, my view personally would be that it is definitely not extant in Hertfordshire at the moment, and probably never has been. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Richard. We don't.
Yes.
You can see it though in some nice localities on the South Downs in Hampshire. Now the other group of helleborines is this genus Epipactis, and it's one of these that's quite difficult to tell apart and does tend to cause some sleepless nights. But there are two species which are tolerably widespread in the county. This is probably the most widespread species in Britain. It's the broad-leaved helleborine. You can see the leaves coming up the stem, and this is the flower spike extending with the beech tree in the background. And in close-up, you can see these are the flowers, and in this group of helleborines, the lip is divided into two parts. There's a hyperchyle at the base and an epicyle at the tip, which is often recurved down and often has raised bumps on it. So, broad-leaved helleborine, as Richard showed, I think, in his survey, is primarily in the southeast of the county, around the Broxbourne Woods area. Over half the records in the databases are from Danemead Nature Reserve, but I think that's because one person goes out every year and counts them and very laudably enters the results onto the database. But it needs an updated survey, so it's on my to-do list for this year. Then there's the violet helleborine. I took this photo. This is Rothamsted. This is the Lime Avenue that extends from the research station up to Rothamsted Manor. And there's always been a number of violet helleborines growing there. And I took this picture, which is a terrible picture, in 1980. My photographic skills have improved a bit since then, and I took these last year at exactly the same site. So this is a long-lasting colony. One feature of the violet helleborine, it tends to have rather purplish violet tinted leaves, and it tends to grow in quite dramatic clumps, multi-stemmed clumps. You quite often see these, and it seems to be quite particularly characteristic of violet helleborine. And this photograph taken by Richard many moons ago really clearly shows that violet tinge onto the leaves. Neither of these were taken in Hertfordshire, but they were very close by the border. One of the four commonest species in Hertfordshire is the common twayblade, and it's quite easy because there's a pair of quite broad saucer-shaped leaves at the base, and then the flowers are quite simple. The labellum is just a greenish, usually strap-shaped object with a notch leading up, perhaps up halfway up the labellum. So this can be seen all over the county in calcareous grasslands, and it even ventures into woodland. What a fantastic place to see it is Hexton chalk pit. It's so numerous there that you have to be careful not to tread on it. Now we're at the time of year when we're looking forward to spring and the bluebells appearing. There are lots of fantastic bluebell woods in the county, and even better, such as Knotwood, Rothamsted, when there are also early purple orchids flowering amongst the bluebells. So a very common species. Alla, who's in the audience, found it for the first time at Hartwood a couple of years ago. It's undoubtedly several of the places where it still remains to be found. It's probably also the earliest flowering orchid in the county, flowering round about, well, the start of May. It can show some colour variation, so there's a very pale pink one. Pure white is quite rare. And it doesn't have to be confined to woodland, because this plant was flowering out on the Serpentine Cliffs in the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. Totally irrelevant to Hertfordshire, but I've just put it in because I love botanising on the lizard. So that's an early purple orchid. Greater butterfly orchid. Now, this time last year I would probably have put this in the not doing okay category. How many people here have been to Millennium Wood at Tring? And if you haven't, it's highly recommended. It's just close to the A41 bypass.
Is it off the county park?
Yeah.
Okay, I went there in the winter.
Well, yes, this is early June. There have been reports of greater butterfly orchids at this location in recent years. Jeff and I, Jeff's another colleague, friend who's sitting over there, we did some of the sites this year, last year, 2025, and as you enter Millennium Wood, you encounter a huge concentration of greater butterfly orchids in perfect flower. There's probably about 300 in the wood as a whole. I mean, when Richard did his survey in the 1970s, early 80s, I think you concluded that this was very rare or absent in the west of the county.
Yeah, mainly in the east.
Yeah. Which is crazy, because if you go just across the border to the Aston Clinton Ragpits Reserve, it's hyper abundant. Anyway, it's lovely to have it there in Millennium Wood, and it seems to be thriving. The other place we saw it this year, this is Oddy Hill near Widdington. It's an area of chalk turf with a lot of common orchids in it, but one of my co-recorders, Astrid, was monitoring a part of this which had been recently cleared for scrub a couple of years ago, and she told me that she thought she'd found greater butterfly orchids there. It's very unlikely, Astrid, because they've never been seen here in the past, and they were there. So, very encouraging signs that this particular species is picking up in the west on the calcareous soils. I don't have any really up-to-date information on how it's doing in little copses in the east, but that's probably another to-do list for this year. Now we come on to this genus Dactylorhiza, which, if any practice keeps you awake at night, Dactylorhiza sometimes gives people nightmares. It is very confusing, sometimes due to extensive hybridisation, but there are 4 species in Hertfordshire. There were 5. And 2 of them are in this doing okay category, especially in the common spotted orchid, which I don't think we need to spend much time on, because everyone should be familiar with that. I think it's rather leggy with these narrow spotted leaves. The labellum is very clearly 3-lobed and usually marked with loops and dashes. A wide variety of habitats as well. So this is another of the 4 most common orchids in Hertfordshire. And there can be white individuals at Hexton Chalk Pit, for example. This is where that photograph was taken. But on the other extreme, there is this variant where the genes encoding anthocyanin pigmentation are overexpressed, and the entire labellum can be almost suffused with purple. And this often throws people in terms of identification. But it is common spotted orchid, and it's what's called var rhodochyla. And it occurred for example, in the Tring area for a number of years. And then moving on to another dactyl rhiza species, the southern marsh orchid. This is reasonably common. It's a specialist in calcareous wetland habitats. Much broader, unspotted leaves, a virtually unnotched lip with diffuse spot markings usually. So Sawbridgeworth, this is the nature reserve on the Essex border. There's quite a lot there. Blagrove Common, where there used to be a lot, and I'll come on to Blagrove shortly. And Frogmore Meadow, which is another trust reserve. And lots of other sites too, Udenhead. So this is doing fine. But at this point, I just want to introduce one concept which often causes problems with this genus. So this is the A41 cutting going through Roughdown Common. Before it was constructed, Richard knew it as a site, quite an unusual dryland site for the southern marsh orchid. It's not there now. But it was occurring with common spotted orchid, and these two species do hybridize. And this is a first generation hybrid between common spotted and southern marsh. Very robust. Flowers that are probably closer to southern marsh, but very densely spotted leaves. It's the first generation hybrid. And you see that quite frequently. If you go above the cutting to where that Gerald Salisbury Cleistogamous plant was, there's a lot of common spotted orchids, but there's a few plants that look like this, and this really is the thing that nightmares are made of, because I don't think it's the first generation hybrid between southern marsh and common spotted. I think it's an introgression product where the hybrid, which is usually reasonably sterile, has backcrossed to one of the parents and produced plants with even more intermediate morphology. So the southern marsh has gone from this location because of the construction of the A41, but it's left behind a legacy which is manifest in the common spotted orchid colony it used to grow with. I don't need to spend any time, I don't think, on pyramidal orchid. The reason it's called pyramidal is that when it's in bud, the inflorescence is markedly pyramidal, but this is responding fantastically to climate change, and it's turning up everywhere in all sorts of habitats, including man-made ones. So we get new sites reported by the tens every year. This is in the same genus, but it's certainly much less frequent. The green-winged orchid only has a few sites in Hertfordshire, but one of them is one of the best sites for this species in the country. So, with the proviso that this is private land, this is Langley Meadow. This is basically a hay meadow on fairly neutral soil. It's an SSSI, it's carefully monitored by Natural England, and last year I went and counted about 20,000 green-winged orchids. And it's been that sort of number for a number of years now. It's a fantastic spectacle round about the middle of May. But you do need really to get permission to go onto this site, which is usually granted. Just examples of green-winged orchid at the Langley site. Can be very variable in colour, but the hood, which is made up of all the perianth segments other than the lip, has these green markings, which is responsible for the name green-veined. And just as an adjunct to that, this is Harpenden Common. I look out onto this through my window. It's what they call the hay meadow area. It's sort of neutral, scrubby, open grassland, which is cut once a year in the autumn. But in 2001, I found this, which is actually a green-winged orchid. It's a pretty crappy one. Nothing for a number of years. And then roughly at the same spot in 2015, there was this. So at this point, I had an idea, and I talked to Tim Hill, and I talked to the town council. I said, should we try and get some seed from Langley Meadow and put it into Harpenden Common to see if we can build up this colony, which has obviously been there for a while. I rang up Natural England and said, yeah, fine. I thought, What, no 20-page form? No, that'll be fine. I called up the owner of Langley Meadow and he said, yeah, come when you want. So I did. And I scattered some seed in 2017. And I warned the town council this wasn't going to happen immediately. With orchids, you have to be patient. So 2018, nothing. 2019, nothing. 2020, nothing. They were beginning to get sceptical, saying, well, it was worth doing, but it hasn't worked. 2021, nothing. And then 2022, we got 6 plants. This is what you might expect for this species. And since then, the colony has been appearing annually. That's a really nice one that's appeared this year, last year, sorry. And so it is beginning to get established as a consequence of seed sowing. And my ambition is to turn this part of Harpen Common into Langley Meadow. And that might take a while. The bee orchid is incredibly erratic. This year's been a terrible year for the bee orchid. This is one of the species that has these labella, fancifully looking like arthropods, a bee maybe. And this is the Environmental Agency office at Welwyn, which isn't too far away, I guess. And there's this grassy bank. And when I was going to a meeting at the Environmental Agency recently, I walked past the bank and it's got a fantastic colony of bee orchids, all about that high. And so I was late for the meeting. and this is one of them. It's had a terrible year last year, and that was due, I think, to the dry spring. A lot of the rosettes that came up in the winter aborted, so we're hoping for some spring rain this year. This is a site at the University of Hertfordshire on the campus, and there's always some bee orchids usually flowering there, and again there's signs saying that this is a bee orchid area, and the estate usually manage to avoid cutting it at the flowering season. The other feature of bee orchid is that it's self-pollinating. The structure of the anatomy of the flower through the year makes it almost impossible for it to outcross. And because of that, you get these unusual variants appearing and then persisting through self-pollination. And this is a variant called Var belgarum, which is quite widely reported around the country, but Richard was telling me, this is his slide. This record at Great Gadsden, just outside Who Wood, was led to the first description of this variant in Britain, or in science. Is that right, Richard?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that was in collaboration with Derek Turner-Attlinger, another great orchidologist. And then there is this variant which the leaf the vellum doesn't curve underneath. It's straight out and tapered to a tip with very diffuse pigmentation. And the name for this is the wasp orchid. It is the bee orchid, but this variety has been called the wasp orchid. And this year we found an example, a few years ago, we found an example of this in Ware, outside the GlaxoSmithKline buildings. Characteristically, it's more common further west around the Cotswolds.
Can I ask a question?
Can we?
Do you want to say questions?
Now let's hold fire.
Yeah.
This is the last species in this doing okay category, and the relentless spread of the lizard orchid. An incredible story, because the lizard orchid was questionably recorded in Hertfordshire back in the sort of 1920s. Nothing since then. It's always had some well-established colonies around the south of England, so this is Sandwich Bay in Kent, the Royal St George's Golf Club. Camber Sands, Sussex, Barrow Dunes, Somerset, and the Devon's Dyke in Cambridgeshire. Those were the main sites for it. But what's happened over the last few years is that single plants have been turning up all over southern England at new locations. So the first of the new era of lizard orchid was near Bruffing in 2020. I got a call from the owner of this private property, and he said, I think I've got a lizard orchid on my lawn. Well, and could I come and see it? Yes, you can, but of course it was lockdown, so I did a Dominic Cummings and decided I needed to check my eyesight. And sure enough, yes, he did have a lizard orchid flowering from seed that must have been broadcast from somewhere else in the country. That was the start of it. 2021. This is 8-year-old Casper, who lives in the northern bit of St Albans, and he was out walking with his parents, and he's a great naturalist actually. He can name a number of flowers, and he spotted this thing, and he went back and fetched his dad, and his dad came back and said, I don't know what it is. He contacted the trust, I think, and the trust contacted me, and Alla and I went with Casper and his parents to see it. It's a fantastic specimen of lizard orchid, and it's flowered every year since 2021 in the same spot. 2023, this is Letchworth. It's the most unassuming bit of an industrial estate. It was found by a guy called Alec Latham, so I suppose if we're calling it Casper's lizard orchid, we should call it Alec's lizard orchid. This is on Plot Hall Common. It was found in 2024 by Finn Harrigan, so that's Finn's lizard orchid, and that has flowered since too. So, you know, we've got these single lizard orchids repeatedly flowering year after year in different locations on more sites coming to our notice. So the question is, are we ever going to get a colony? And normally lizard orchids tend to be outcrossing, but they're perfectly capable of self-compatibility. If an insect, for example, walks up and down a spike and deposits pollen from one flower into another. So there is an opportunity for a single plant to found a colony. And in 2024, Andrew, who owns the site at Bruffing, said, I've got 12 on my lawn. So I think Richard and I went over at that point, and then last year he said, I think I've got 70, 7-0. And Jeff and I went over, and sure we have. This is lawn near Bruffing, and it's incredible. The only problem for him is that his wife likes to keep the lawn cut. So thinking about this talk, I gave him a ring today because lizard orchid is one species which you can monitor in the winter because it puts up an overwintering rosette of leaves, and they're very characteristic. And I said, how's it doing this winter? He said, hang on. I went to look out of the kitchen window, and he said, oh geez, lots. So yeah, we have at least one colony now established from a single individual in 2020. Right. So, good news so far. What's not doing okay? Well, it's a bit subjective what you put into this category, but certainly two of these Epipactis halibarines are very, very in serious trouble. The narrow-lipped, which has this prolonged, tapered, pointed lip, used to be in a number of places in Parkwood, Tring. This is a photo of Richard's, I think, yes, 1981. These days you can't find it in Parkwood. It's dried out. The beechwoods have dried out. There's no sign of it. But it did also have a location at Stubbings Wood, which is just south of the bypass at Tring. A little lane that leads to the alpaca factory, and then it ends at Stubbings Wood. And it was considered lost from Stubbings Wood in the 1980s. And a colleague of mine, Darren Stanley, and I went in 2020 to check our eyesight, and we refound it. We refound the narrow-lipped halibarine in Stubbings Wood, quite a few plants. Since then it's flowered annually, but it is in trouble. It's very small numbers. But then again, because of the drying out of beechwoods, this is a species that's also in trouble in other parts of the country. The second one is the green-flowered halibarine, or sometimes called the pendulous-flowered halibarine, which, as you can see, does have these pendulous flowers, which sometimes don't open very much. One of the classic sites for that was Rushy Meadow near Willstone Reservoir in Tring. Richard and I, a few years ago probably, went to see how it was doing, and not only did we not find the orchid, we couldn't find Rushy Meadow, which has now disappeared under scrub. So that's gone for sure. We also went to this site that Richard knew near Frithston, an open beech and cherry wood, we couldn't find a trace of it, and the ground there is as dry as a bone. You know, there's no ground floor at all, so it's no longer there. The only place where it does occur, for sure, although unless you know better, is Harbour Green Wood, not far from here in Welland. To get to this, you walk up through this very upmarket residential area, I think it's called Oaklands, and then you emerge in the wood. And this infuriates me, this plant, because there's plenty of places in the wood where it could grow and it would be quite well protected. But it grows right at the edge of these ever-widening footpaths. And you know, last year there were, I think, 15, 20 plants, so it's a reasonable sized colony. But it's just hard to see how it's going to manage to persist in this area. But it is, as far as we know now, the only extant colony in the county. The final species of Epipactis is the marsh helleborine, which is a much more showy species. It's characteristic of calcareous wetlands, basic flushes. Used to have a few sites, but they were long lost because of drainage. It still occurs at Bury Mead near Ardley, which is quite a remote spot in the east of the county. It's a lovely bit of wetland, which is still actually quite botanically rich. But as far as I'm aware, it's completely without protection. It's in private hands. It ought to be a reserve. And there are, I don't know, you know, a dozen or so plants of marsh helleborine each year. The reason I put Foulwells down here at the bottom is there's a site called Foulwell Springs, which is north of Wormley Wood. And it used to have a fantastic wetland flora, but I'd heard that it had been completely drained and spoilt and destroyed. There have been rumours, it had marsh helleborine in the past, there have been rumours that it's been put back there or it's reappeared. And I don't know, I can't substantiate those. I don't even know if the site is suitable. So again, it's on the to-do list for this coming year, unless any of you can illuminate me at this point. Something different, the bird's nest orchid, looks a bit like a parasitic broomrape. It's not a parasite, it does lack chlorophyll, but it's a saprophyte, it feeds on decaying plant material. Used to be quite a few sites scattered around the county, they all have gone, as far as I'm aware, with the exception of a wonderful bit of exposed chalk bank below what's called New Plantation, Great Offley. And here there are about 20 individuals, maybe 30 of this plant every year. And usually it grows in dense woodland, so it's so difficult to photograph, but here it's growing in the open, which is brilliant. I think that's the only location, unless anyone knows better. Musk orchid. One of Hertfordshire's best kept botanical secrets is Tingley Wood, Tingley Down below Tingley Wood. It's in private hands, it's owned, the whole of Tingley Estate is owned by Tyndale. He's very proud of it and he's willing to grant access, but again, it's a no-no in terms of trespassing. But it has historically been probably the strongest site for this species, which is rather inconspicuous, called the musk orchid, and Richard kept an eye on it for several years, and in 1981 recorded 65 spikes. But according to Trevor's Flora and general opinion, it was lost from Tingley around about the mid-80s. So Darren Stanley and I, having refound the narrow-lipped helleborine in Stubbings Wood, did actually manage in 2021 to re-find the musk orchid on Tingley Down, so it's still there. Not very many. This is Darren showing his great delight at the discovery. And I didn't realise this photograph exposed his navel, so I must apologise. But yes, there's a small colony still persists at Tingley, and I would say there's a great argument for trying to augment the colony from maybe from other sites where this plant is more abundant. And I think it was last year we had a Hearts Flora group meeting, actually at Tingley Wood. And people were generally very actively surveying the botany. This is just a temporary stop for lunch. And you can see here Jean, for example, who is a regular attendee at flora group meetings. So a wonderful site. A large number of common orchids, but also this added attraction of being the only location in the county for musk orchid. So now we come to Blagrove Common, and I'm back to this genus Dactyloryza. You could argue that people who are absolutely fascinated by this genus, like Richard and myself, could be called dactylorchidologists. And at the time when Richard took this photo in the early 1980s, Blagrove Common was a dactylorchidological paradise. I'm sorry, I slipped up on there, but it had enormous numbers of common spotted, southern marsh, and a species I haven't introduced yet called early marsh, and in incredible quantity. And because they were so common, there were also all the possible hybrid combinations between those three species as well. And in 1987, Richard organised a field meeting of the Herts Natural History Society, which he said was probably the last Herts Natural History meeting he went on. But basically what he did was give everyone a clipboard, a pen, a ruler, and a list of morphological characters to measure. And they went round from plant to plant, and it was quite neat to show from those data the differences between the pure species, but also get hints as to what the origin of some of these hybrids were. So, a great example of a field meeting put to good scientific use. This is the early marsh orchid, and in this form, which is not only incarnata the species, but subspecies incarnata, it's got this flesh pink colour. It's, to me, a plant of really, really great pristine wetland habitat. Here it is at Blagrove in 1981, where it was in abundance. Blagrove 2020, this was the only plant I could find. Blagrove has dried out horribly. The marsh orchids have virtually disappeared, and it's now mostly common spotted and the legacy of hybrids with southern marsh. Work is underway to try and correct that. But this has made the early marsh orchid a very rare plant at Blagrove. Sawbridgeworth, historically it's been quite common there, but I asked Vanessa McMillan, who's a member of the flora group and lives close by, to go out last year and see if she could spot and count early marsh orchids, and she said, well, yes, there's one. There's lots of southern marsh, but there's one early marsh. So this characteristic subspecies of base-rich fen is really, really rare in the county now. You can go to East Anglia to some of the broad habitats, and it's abundant, but it's really, really rare in Hertfordshire. But there is sort of add-on to that, which is, this is Amwell Nature Reserve, and this is the area by the Hollycross Dragonfly Walk. Early marsh orchids have been put in here from Rye Mead, where they turned up unexpectedly and unpredictably in pulverised fly ash which had been dumped there. When Rye Mead colony was threatened, I think the Wildlife Trust themselves moved some plants to this area at Amwell. And they're still there in quite good quantity. And some of them are very absolutely perfect ringers for this subspecies incarnata, but some of them are getting rather red, and as they get more redder, they come to resemble a subspecies that's more characteristic of the coastal dunelands. And some of them are very rich purple, and now they're mimicking a subspecies called Pulchella, which is characteristic of acid wetland. So we don't know why this particular colony is so variable, but it's come from an introduced group of plants that turned up in this pulverised fly ash. So we can't really regard it as a native colony of early marsh, but if you want to see the species in Hertfordshire, it's by far the easiest place to go now.
What time is that?
Early June. And then the final of the four species of Dactyloryza that are still extant is the heath spotted, which is a close relative of common spotted, but it has this more entire labellum, slender spur. And you often hear the term blousy, to describe the labellum. I don't think that is a technical botanical term, but this is probably the most abundant orchid in Britain in terms of numbers. If you go to Scotland, if you go to Wales, it's all over the hillsides. In Hertfordshire there are 2 colonies, one at Frogmore and this one at Bricket Wood. There's one in Middlesex and one in Bedfordshire. It's really rare down here in the southeast. So this is Bricket Wood taken by Richard in the 1980s. Really great squelchy habitat, quite a lot of, this is the SSSI area of Bricket Wood. Squelchy habitat, lots of heath-spotted orchids present, and there still are a few plants in this area, but unfortunately it's drying out fast, and that's probably led to the decline. But when I was there a few years ago, I talked to Tanya Dickinson, who is the warden who looks after Bricket Wood for the district council, and she took me to a clearing completely away from the SSSI, and hundreds of plants of heath-spotted orchid all alongside a path that leads through the clearing, and the rest, as you can see, is mostly bracken. I've been pleading with district council to clear this clearing. It's otherwise it's completely choked with bracken and scrubs, and then the heath-spotted orchid will have a new habitat to expand out into. So again, that's work in progress, particularly for this year. So it's doing well in this one location in Bricket Wood, which is not the original location where it was well known. This is a bit of a surprise to put in this not doing well category, because this is Aston Clinton Ragpits just across the border in Buckinghamshire. Fantastic site for orchids. If you see these signs, basically they're saying, wild orchids, please keep to the paths, which people do. And one of the real features of Aston Clinton is a fantastic abundance of chalkland fragrant orchid. It really is almost impossible to count them. And it's extraordinary that given its abundance there, and it's very common at Knockinghoe just across the border in Bedfordshire, it seems to be incredibly uncommon in Hertfordshire. And Tingley Down has got some. They haven't done very well at all for the last few years because, and guess why, it's drying out. Here it's growing next to a common spotted orchid. Hexton Chalkpit used to be a headquarters for it too. It's incredibly difficult to find at Hexton these days. This was a grotty one found in 1994. That's not a picture I'm particularly proud of. But you know, chalk fragrant orchid should be one of our most common species, and it's surprisingly uncommon. And I think finally in this section, fly orchid. Relative of the bee orchid, but the labellum is quite different, with these lobes here at the top and an iridescent patch of blue in the middle. Who Bit has always been a good site for it on Telegraph Hill, but it's these days that bit of woodland is full of white hellebreens, as I said earlier. It's quite difficult to find fly orchids there these days. There's probably about 6 or 7 sites for it in the county where it grows in small quantity. Aubrey Knowes is another. And the only site in central Hertfordshire, other than those in the north and west, is this site at Lake St Lawrence, Priors Wood. Priors Wood is owned by a friend of ours called Simon Leadbeater, who's very, very frustrated that the fly orchid grows about 10 metres away from his property. But it's still there, and but it's a species which has got a few sites, but low numbers, and a little bit precarious for that reason. There's nowhere where it's really, really abundant. So, what have we lost? And I'm going to race through these now quite quickly. 7 species. Man orchid, I don't think anyone I know has ever seen a man orchid in Hertfordshire. It's supposed to have disappeared around about the 1960s, but it occurred at one site in Offaly. This is one of my favourite man orchid sites at Gray's Chalk Pit in Hertfordshire, in Essex. And you can see that the labellum is arms and legs. That's why it's called a man orchid. On the continent there's a thing called naked man orchid, which has an additional appendage. Bird-tip orchid, this is a photograph taken from Trevor's Flora. I haven't seen a genuine photograph, but It's quite common across the border at Knocking Hoe. It's a plant of chalk downland. Burnt tip because the unopened buds at the top give it that sort of appearance. Last known at Thurfield Heath, hasn't been seen for about 40 years, despite constant searching. Dense flowered fragrant orchid, or marsh fragrant orchid, has always been very uncommon, and it occurred at this site. I don't know if you call it Moor Hall or whether you call it Berry Mead, but they're adjacent anyway. This photograph is again from Trevor's Flora, and it hasn't been seen for, what, Richard, 30, 40 years? Now this is the autumn ladies' tresses with this characteristic spiral of white flowers. It should be common in Hertfordshire, but the last individual, this is not just the last site. Richard reckons he photographed this as the last individual seen in Hertfordshire. Alpine Meadow is currently undergoing some restoration. I think there might be a plan to reintroduce the autumn ladies' tresses, but it's so common around the country, it turns up as a colonist on lawns. It must be somewhere. Please, please keep your eyes out for this, open for this one. And the frog orchid, again we're back to this genus Dactylorhiza. This is sheet hanger common. It used to be in a number of sites, but the last site was sheet hanger common. Looking at it from the road, this is the road from Hemel Hempstead to Amersham. And there's a sort of quarry here. There's some open turf downland which wasn't part of the golf course because it's because of the topography. And it had a colony, quite a sizable colony of frog orchids. For some reason, I'm not entirely clear of the history, they stopped the golf course there and the whole site got scrubbed over and the frog orchid disappeared. But I'm quite convinced that with management of sheet hanger, you could either bring it back from the dead if it's still there, or reintroduce it. This is the third member of the bee orchid group, and it's the early spider orchid. It's native in Kent, Sussex, Dorset. This chalk pit in Little Haddam, I think in the 1970s it was deliberately introduced to this. I don't think there's any doubt that it was actually a deliberate introduction, but for a while it seemed to like it. Increased to 50 plants by 1993, and then the chalk pit changed hands, it got scrubbed over, and the assumption is that it's now gone. But when I put this bit of a talk together, I thought, well, I don't need proof of that. I haven't been there for 20 years. So maybe it would be worth another visit to see if this species is still hanging on. And the final one in this category, it's a sad story. This is the Cemex cement works between Hatfield and St Albans. These are the conveyor belts that carry the stuff that they're digging up and to headquarters. And I think it was 2017, I'll check on that in a minute. Ian Carl at the Trust got a phone call saying we'd found a military orchid somewhere on this site. Military orchid would be a fantastic find because it's dead rare. There's only 3 native sites in Britain. It used to occur in about the 1900s and 1910s on the chalk slopes and around the Chiltern area of Hertfordshire. We being Trevor James, Chris James and I, went out in 2000, it was 2016. This was an incredibly high-profile trespass in hindsight, because they now guard this with dogs and machine guns. But yes, they were right, it was a military orchid. This is Trevor. I don't know why he's pointing his camera over there, because this is the plant. and that's a military orchid, sometimes called a soldier orchid. You know, arms, legs, helmet. Just a fantastic rediscovery. I mean, who knows how it got there? Very, very unknown provenance, but there's no reason why it couldn't be seed that's come in. So we were all very excited about that. I didn't go the following year. The year after that, there was nothing to be seen. And the year after that, Richard and I and Scott Chalmers went to the site, and we found two flowering spikes and a barren rosette. So what had happened is that it's reproduced vegetatively through tuber division. There were no new plants, but this was the original plant that was expanded. So brilliant. So I couldn't wait when it came to 2020, when I needed to check my eyesight. I went out there and found this. The whole bank has been totally ruined and covered with some... Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what might have happened here. I was told that Cemex were aware that they had a very rare plant on their site. That can have positive or negative impact. But it's gone, I'm afraid. Its reign was brief, but it was lovely to have it back for a while. Right. What might be gained? I just want to quickly introduce you to a genus called Serapius, the tongue orchids, because these are widespread on the continent. There's a lot of species on the continent. More and more in recent years we've been finding isolated individuals of some of these tongue orchids turning up in the south of England. Not in Hertfordshire yet. So this is rough amenity grassland Tiptree, Essex, and for the last 10 years or so this has had a colony of the common tongue orchid. And you can see that the labellum here does have a fanciful resemblance to a tongue. And this has increased now to about 100 plants. It's well established, but there is, I understand, a threat of a housing development on this site. So we're waiting to see what happens there. It's the only established colony of this species so far in the UK. And the final species is the small-flowered tongue orchid. This differs because you can see that the tongue-shaped lip is much smaller. It's occurred for about 10 years or 20 years on the border of Cornwall and Devon at Penby Point. And there are a few plants, you may be able to see wire mesh cages there. When I visited, these were protecting the few remaining plants that are present. And that's one of those. Disappeared in 2008, so it's gone from there. And was that the end of small-flowered tongue orchid in Britain? Well, fortunately not. So, on the left here, this is the New Mura building in the City of London. So behind me taking this picture would be St Paul's Cathedral. And just the other side of the building would be the Thames. And if you go into the foyer area, you encounter a lot of people who look as though they might be Japanese. And the way they're dressed, they could well be bankers. Which makes a lot of sense because New Mura is the British headquarters of a Japanese bank. And why would people interested in orchids want to visit this building? Well, they've got a roof garden which has become very famous because of the plants that have grown there, especially the small-flowered tongue orchid. So you go in, you take a lift to the 11th floor, and finally you go up a rickety staircase and you come out through this trapdoor. And there's this incredible roof garden which has about 150 different species of wildflower. But the guy who looks after it, called Mark Patterson, first found small-flowered tongue orchid in small numbers, probably come in naturally, wind-dispersed seed. And he's been looking after it since. So you can see here, it's in pretty good quantity, and I think it was about 2024, Richard and I joined a very elite group allowed to go on the roof. They don't really welcome visitors, partly because of health and safety issues, because we could be blown over into the Thames. But at this point, 2 years ago, there were about 500 plants of the species on the roof. None around the side of the building, just on the roof. I spoke to the guy who looks after the site this morning, and he said they've got at least 1,000 rosettes this year, which should be flowering around about May, June. We're begging him for permission to go back again. But it just goes to show that these tongue orchids are finding conditions to their liking, and increasingly as a consequence of climate change. So they're turning up in a lot of different locations, and surely in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years we'll be finding at least one of these species present in Hertfordshire. So there's a species we might gain rather than the sequence that we've lost. Again, just a few more of those orchids in the roof garden. You can see this underneath there's this sedum, that they usually used to seed initially their own. to seed these roof gardens before they get established with new species. That's my email address. Now, if anyone would like more information on locations, but especially if they want to send me information on locations we don't know about, that would be fantastic. And also, I think we've got a few minutes now for questions and discussion. So, thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Ian. Fascinating. I heard the odd people want to chip in questions, so I was...
Yes, Claudia.
Yeah, Claudia.
So with the bee orchid, you said that the bottom lip was mimicking or thought to mimic the bee. But then you said it's pretty much a self-pollinator.
Yes.
So paradox.
It's very bizarre, isn't it? I mean, maybe you could explain this, Rich, but the assumption is that labellum is specialised to attract a particular group of pollinators, but it can't be out. It's almost impossible to outcross it.
So
The problem is that the pollen mass is on a very, very thin stalk. So the slightest vibration, wind, whatever, pushes the pollen mass straight down onto the stigma of the same flower. So in theory, it is insect pollinated, but in practice, the insects very rarely get to have their way with it.
yeah, because as soon as the insect approaches, it's going to shake the barn.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe that is it's trying to self-pollinate using insects.
Well, put it this way, it's easily the most ecologically successful of the
Well, yeah, it's working.
insect
So
mimicking
we're not knocking
orchids.
it,
So
yeah. Okay. There we go.
You planted obviously in the area in Harpenden, and it sort of took 4 or 5 years before. What are those seeds doing? Are they just sitting there for 5 years?
I mean, it would have been fantastic when you're trying to do a transplantation like that to transplant tubers, but I'd never have got permission to do that, I don't think. The problem with the thing about orchid seeds is they are absolutely minute. They have no reserves at all. They're produced by the million. And they land, the first thing they have to do is to form a symbiotic relationship with the fungus in the soil to gather reserves. And over a period of years, those reserves are converted into the tuber that eventually becomes sufficient to put up a flowering spike. So, I mean, it varies from species to species, but I would have said that 3 to 6 years from seed is probably...
So if you had a microscope, you would be seeing, this relationship starting.
Yeah.
No leaves or anything. It's
No.
Right.
No. You have to be patient.
Yeah.
Hi, right, and you come in.
Sorry, me first.
Yes.
So you say that the seed is very small, and you were talking about wind-blown seed.
Yes.
So is it a bit like fungal spores? Do you think there's orchid seed in the air all over the place?
The aerial plankton.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm quite convinced, the lizard orchids, for example, I don't know where, and it's probably coming from the UK colonies or maybe even across the channel, but millions of seeds are being blown in, coming down.
Right.
The chances of them germinating, finding the exact right place to germinate is vanishingly small, but there's so many of them, that you are going to get some.
however, there's a study done by a really interesting Dutch group who looked at, they actually captured the seed as it landed within a single meadow, and they found that the successful germinations, 90% occurred within a metre of the mother plant. So they're utilising exactly the same fungus. So the successful long-distance dispersals are very, very rare. But on the other hand, the orchids are producing vast numbers of seed.
I don't suppose you could get the fungus and the seed at the same time and sprinkle them together.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There you go.
you can do that. If you,
But it won't speed things up necessarily. It'll just increase the chances of success.
Ian, over here.
Yes.
Is it a particular type of fungus, or are they varied what they can use?
Now there's a loaded question, and I think I might defer to Richard because yeah, go on.
sorry, what was the question?
How fastidious are they in terms of the fungus?
Some are incredibly fastidious, others will just form a relationship with just anybody. They're nice people. But what I was going to say is I've been president of the Hardy Orchid Society for 26 years now, and we actually provide both seed and fungi to people who want them.
Out of interest, sorry, go on, David.
I was just going to ask, given that information, are there any sites in Hertfordshire you have your eye on in terms of future introduction?
Yeah, I mean, how many people here have been to Clothall Common? I think that's a fantastic site, and that's largely built on spoil from building the Baldock bypass. And it's becoming incredibly botanically diverse. It's basically chalk. And I mean, it's getting colonised naturally, but that's going to turn into, I think, a really fantastic site. Yeah, I mean, the problem is if you're thinking about, well, you know, where might we put orchids, you've got to think about, are we going to have resources to either restore or manage that site as well? Alpine Meadow for the Autumn Ladies' Treasure is an example. I don't know, I think a lot of work, there's a lot of work's going into Alpine Meadow to restore its former condition. And really there's no point in putting the orchid in there until the plant is guaranteed a high success rate. So yeah, I'm not going to start listing off sites. There are loads, but they do need some sort of attention, I think.
Just talking of spoil, are we hopeful of good results with the HS2? Is it at Rippensworth? West Tide?
I don't,
There's a lot of
I
material.
don't know what the plans are for it.
There's a lot of material.
Yeah.
They talk about what they're going to do.
I think Clothall shows, you know, that you can use this spoil for a good purpose. If you go to Kent, where the entrance to the channel, the Channel Tunnel, Folkestone, they put a lot of the spoil to create a new sort of a peninsula called Sunfire Hoe, and that is one of the best sites in, well, it might be the best site in Britain for the early spider orchid, which is colonised from nearby. So yeah, I mean, spoil can be used incredibly productively. So I don't know what specifically they have in mind for HS2, but you might do.
No, that's the question.
Go on then, Tim.
Just on the early March orchids at Amwell, Ian, I just wanted to give credit where credit is due. The reintroduction actually took place before the trust took on the site. It was Graham, Mike, Trevor James and Tom Gladwin's project because one was closing down. My second point was, when I worked for the Valley Regional Park back in the late 80s, pulverised fuel ash was very common in Cheshire gravel pits. And at one stage we had 10,000 early March orchids on an area about the size of
Where was this?
2 tennis courts, North Met Pit in Cheshire gravel pits, and it's succeeded to willow scrub and alder, and now it's dense woodland. But we worked very closely with Peter Shaw at Roehampton, and he was doing a lot of research into PFA and early March orchids, not only in the Lee Valley but elsewhere. I just wondered if you knew if he was still working on those and whether there was any opportunity to potentially bring pulverised fuel ash into suitable locations where it's damp and start the process going again, because it was incredible to see so many orchids in one place.
Yeah. I mean, when the PDA was right east, there were areas along the river of Cheshunt where the ash was dumped too, and they for a while, I don't think they are now, they had incredible quantities of early marsh orchids, southern marsh orchids, or every combination, every colour almost.
But presumably with us going carbon zero, there aren't many coal-fired power stations producing pulverised fuel ash.
Probably not, no.
Do all orchids need fungi to thrive? British ones at least.
I think so, but the problem is that I don't think there are any species that produce seeds large enough to germinate on their own accord.
They vary a lot in the level of dependency, but the one common factor is you need multiple fungi, because the one that encourages germination of the seed tends not to be the one that supports the mature plant. One partner's not enough.
So do we
It's only been my experience.
Do we have, building on that, do we have a sense then whether it's the absence of the fungi that's the limiting factor? Given there's millions of these seeds sort of floating around, is it the fungi that's the limiting factor or some other factor?
It's generally reckoned that the fungi are the primary factor. But there's many other things coming into play. One of the things that interests me at the moment is I'm convinced that chalkland orchids that are south-facing don't like life much anymore, and they're moving to be east-facing or west-facing rather than south-facing. And I've been watching colonies migrate. And of course, the way that we actually record botanical distributions in this country doesn't capture movement of that small scale. But I think that is the reaction to climate change at the moment. They're sensible enough to try to get out of the sun.
I'm just following on from that. In Paxton Hill, the VCN have that letter E shaped mound that they're doing a lot of topology and colonisation. So that might be a site. It's literally a spoil in the shape of the letter E. So you have all those aspects in there, and they're looking at what's recolonising it at the Paxton.
That's
So,
cool. Where is this? Paxton?
yeah,
Yes.
with the beds, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's whatever the surveys. they have.
Yes, I know a lot of this site restoration is more entomologically inspired than botanical, but sometimes you can win-win.
Okay.
Yeah, what's the butterflies?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, but probably time for one last question if there's a final question. Steve, go on.
If you're a non-expert such as myself and just see orchids, I often just associate 1 or 2 or 3, 4 different species. Do you think we're missing quite a lot of the rarities simply because of the lack of skill in observing? Because you identified lots of variants and things that look like other ones.
Yes. I suspect probably not, because most of the orchids you really do need to know where you're going to find them. You do sometimes stumble over rarer ones, but it's I don't think so. I mean, Twayblade is an exception perhaps, because Twayblade is so difficult to spot unless you're really close up. But the others, you probably, musk orchid, that's almost impossible to see when you're standing next to it. But you'll be incredibly lucky to find a musk orchid. So no, I think that, but what we would like to encourage everyone, how many people use iRecord? I mean, we throw in any records, it's the common orchids we really need to know more about. In some respects, we know where the rarities are and we know what the problems affecting them are, but we need to know more about the more common species. And this pyramidal orchid has undergone an astounding increase over the last few years, but we don't really have it documented properly because people are putting in records for pyramidal orchid every time they find it. So please do, not just orchids, all plants, all animals, but yeah, I would encourage that.
Brilliant. No.
We do actually, as county recorders, go to iRecord and try to keep up to date with verifying records. So it's not just going into a black hole. We do try to process them as quickly as possible.
Yeah, brilliant. Look, Ian, thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I certainly don't count myself as an orchid or even flora expert, but there was a lot of stuff I learned there. And just show my ignorance, I'm not even sure I'd necessarily have thought of some of the hellebore species you were talking about there as orchids. So it just shows my level of ignorance. But thank you, and reiterate what you said about the importance of iRecord as a means of, or any other means of submitting records, really important. But Ian and Richard, thank you hugely for coming. Thank you.